Hi, this is Jim from Vaudevisuals. I'm here with Nathan Wakefield, the author of the new book, The Rise and Fall of the Sideshow Geek, published very proudly by Outside Talker Press, and it's quite a gem. It's quite a gem. So tell us, what prompted you to write a book about sideshow geeks?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Jim. But I tell people the genesis to my book was really a late night rage writing session. And what I mean by that is that I've always been interested in kind of like the darker and weird side of variety entertainment. And when I was younger, reading a lot of old timey sideshow books, they went into a lot of details about, like sword swallowers and fire eaters and a lot of the working acts and, some of the people that were born differently and exhibited themselves. But so many of these books, they'd say, oh, and then there were geeks that did this. Anyways, back to this other stuff. And they just really glossed over the subject. And I was like, man, it's such a gruesome and weird act. There's got to be more to it than just this really concise, abridged version that I'm seeing in a lot of these books. There's got to be more history to it. And I had all these questions like, were there any famous geeks? How did the geek act start? How did showmen run geek acts operationally? What was the business like? Because they're not around now, so how did it kind of crash and burn over time? What was the public perceptions like? And so I started basically writing on my computer. I was like, if I were to write a book about geeks, I'd write this, and I'd address this, and I'd talk about this and this, and I did that. And then over the next few months, I started kind of filling in the questions with some stuff I was finding out through research. And then over time, it just started expanding to the point where I was like, oh my gosh, if I reordered this and approached this with a little fleshing out some of these other points, this could actually be a full-length book in and of itself. And so that pretty much resulted in what was ultimately published.
That's awesome. That's awesome, and it's such a gem. I mean, when you sent me the text originally, I actually read it in 2 nights. It was like right through. It's such a well written book. It's such a fun adventure. I mean, you're really walking through the back alleys of the sideshow. It's really terrific, And in the book, you have some really interesting categories for chapters. You have early eaters, human ostriches, and geek magic. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about these different categories?
Sure. So with the early eaters, the idea there was that, the idea of eating something gross or weird is so primitive. I mean, we can even remember being as kids, daring our classmates to eat clay or paper or something weird just because it's like, oh, so-and-so did that, but it elicits a reaction of shock, disgust, but also intrigue. We kind of are curious about that. And so even though the geek stuff didn't really come into the carnival and fair stuff earnestly until the late 1890s and early 1900s, there were people infamous for eating either strange things or large quantities of things that were written about in history well before that. And so I thought it would be kind of my due diligence to address some of those historical creatures that kind of predated the geek act as we know it today and kind of give them their due and kind of get into some of the biographical information about them. So that was the idea about the early eaters, is to kind of take it back and talk about some geek-like figures in history.
That's great. And
then with things like...
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, then some of the other stuff too, like the human ostriches and geek magic, the idea there was to talk about some kind of allied arts, some allied acts that were akin to geek and had either that feeling or certain elements of geek, but depending on how you look at it, are not exactly geek in the traditional sense. So that's why I kind of put those chapters in there to have a more complete picture about all things geek.
And bring it up to date, and you have a really nice reference to bringing it up to date for the 21st century with Alice Cooper in geek music, and then geek magic also, where the performers in doing magic tricks or magic acts who are actually tapping into that genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Like with the geek magic, I mean, you think about the idea of the geek act, and kind of like I alluded to earlier, the real idea there is not to awe someone with technical prowess or titillate them with something, that's really attractive. It's shock and disgust, and that's what makes it entertaining. And so there in geek magic, it's presenting illusions that are to shock and disgust. You're doing gross or shocking magic. And so I touched upon just that idea in magic, geek magic. It's akin to the feeling that you would get from a geek show. And then I took it a step further by actually talking about the history of some of the classic magic acts that didn't just do geek magic, but also did magic tricks involving live animals, oftentimes using like simulated or sometimes real decapitations, like you'd actually see in a geek show. And curiously enough, what is arguably the very first written depiction of magic in the sense that the performative arts actually comes from the Westcar Papyrus about a magician named Didi who went before an Egyptian pharaoh and would remove the heads off of various animals and birds and then restore them once again. So it's kind of interesting that very motif goes all the way back to ancient times. So I thought it was pretty cool just kind of connecting those dots.
That's great. I mean, the research you did on this was phenomenal. I mean, you said you spent quite a few years working on this project.
32 pages of works cited sources. 5 years.
5 years.
Woo!
5 years, yeah. And it's shows.
Yeah, and I was really pleased too, because I was able to not just go through a lot of newspaper archives and old books, but I was able to get a lot of cooperations from universities, and I was thrilled to be able to conduct some completely original, one-of-a-kind interviews with a lot of show people and thought leaders that knew a lot about the subject, and then integrate that into my work as well to give it a lot of originality. So I'm like getting these thoughts and presenting my own analysis, so I'm not just simply regurgitating facts as written. So it was kind of good to kind of piece it together through that way.
And there was a delay in the publishing of the book because you had one final interview that you wanted to grab before the book was done. Well, what happened? Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's actually two interviews, because I imagine this probably happens with just about any author, especially in nonfiction. I'm speculating, but when you announce that you're publishing a book, up until that point, you're kind of doing a lot of your research on your own or with your maybe a few close associates, but it's essentially on the down low. But once you put it out into the public that this book is coming out about this, you get this huge net that you're casting, and people that might be familiar with that subject reach out to you and be like, oh, I had no idea you were writing this. I've done this or this. And I had two leads come in right after we had announced that we were publishing the book. The first one was a woman reached out to me and said, there's this an old-timey showgirl out in Las Vegas who, when she was a little girl, used to perform as a geek in her parents' sideshow. You should reach out to her. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. Maybe I'll do that. And then about that same time, I had a college professor reach out to you, and then you forwarded it to me. And he said, I've been studying geeks since the 80s. I have all these files, and I even have original interviews that that he personally conducted like 30 years ago with showmen about their geek shows, and they have since passed away, and they're all in this like manila file. And I interviewed him, and he gave me some great thoughts about this. And then a couple days after our interview, he messaged me and said, Nathan, I found the file. Do you want me to mail it to you? You can use whatever you want from it.
Oh.
And so, yeah, I was like, wow. And that's why I said, Jim, can we pump the brakes here? I want to interview this Vegas showgirl that used to geek. I just interviewed this professor, and now he's sending me this trove of unpublished geek information. And you were gracious enough to say, I understand, let's pump the brakes. And so that resulted in a couple months delay, but absolutely worth it. It really fleshed out, some more interesting stuff about the book. And it was just really fascinating how that all unfolded.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So in the book, there's a couple of appendixes which are quite extraordinary and deep and researched. And could you just give us a couple of examples, like Jacques Simon and Serpentina, for example?
Yeah, so I was really, as I was putting together the book, I was getting a lot of really good source material, and a lot of old Sideshow stuff. It was pitch books that were promotional books that had minimal and concise biographical information about some of these performers, and they sell them at their shows. And I was able to get some original pitch books. I got one for Serpentina. I mentioned her in there, so I was like, it'd be cool to put her pitch book in the back. Just like 4 pages. If people wanted to see like the actual historic facsimile, like a complete scan of it, I thought that was doing like a good historical service. And I had 2 other, not necessarily pitch books, but abridged biographical information that were in different languages. One was on the Jacques character you mentioned. I had an entire French biography on him, and I had it translated into English. Now, here's a funny thing. We got that. I put the English translation, full thing, as an appendix in the book, and we published it. And then, like, just a couple months after we released the book, a very noteworthy magic periodical released their new issue with that guy on the front and said, we just translated this biography on him, and it's going to be in English for the first time ever. So we beat them to the punch by just a couple months, completely unbeknownst to all of us. It's just so funny how that works out.
That's great. That's great.
And I also got a few other ones. Like I had there was another one. It was a Mac Norton. He was a European that would swallow frogs. I had an actual medical pamphlet on him that I had translated into English, so people could kind of get like the study perspective on how he was able to master regurgitation. So I put that in there, and a few other just things that I felt were like good points of reference to people that were interested in allied arts related to geeks from a historical perspective as written. That was kind of my idea for including those.
That's great. And you're also a performer, not just an author. Tell us about your performing career.
Yes, I do. I love the variety arts. I say I'm a performer, advocate, and historian. So I try to do a good job when I perform. Then I also try to help grow the community and help others out, and then write about it because it fascinates me. I love documenting it. I often perform as Nathan McScary. That's my stage name I use the most. Primarily juggling, but I also do sideshow and fire. And I guess you could say my brand is I'm kind of like the classy vaudeville gentleman juggler that's also crossed with a complete sideshow maniac. So I have like that weird contrast of class and then just insanity. Just
Nathan, thank you so much for the time, and thank you so much for your book. It's really a gem. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye.